Hi guys. So today we're going to do an IFR flight from Mike 91 over to Mike 54, which is a flight I did at VFR not too long ago, and I posted a video on that. But I've had several comments. I've had several people asking me to give some commentary. I usually don't talk a whole lot in the flight videos I post, but uh, quite a few people have asked me to, say something, at least try to explain to people what exactly I'm doing in the cockpit. For you veteran flight simmers, you're probably going to know all this, or pilots. I mean, you're going to know all this stuff anyways, for the most part, I would think. So I don't have a script here I'm going by. I'm just going to try to do this flight, and as things come to me, I'll just try to explain what I'm doing, what I'm not doing. So I don't know if this is going to be helpful or not. This could be a terribly long video. Fortunately, there's a fast forward button somewhere down here, when you're watching this. So if you want to just skip through some stuff, just by all means, go right ahead. I'll start with this aircraft. This is an A36 Bonanza. This is the TC model. So it's turbocharged. It has tip tanks. And I'll just go through some of this stuff in the cockpit for those who are learning this stuff and trying to figure it out. It's a lot to take in, and I'm assuming that you're probably watching all kinds of videos on stuff. So I'll just start right down here at some of the basic stuff and explain a few things. You're going to find some things in this cockpit that you're not going to find in a trainer aircraft like a 172 for the most part. And I'll explain what some of those are, because a lot of people are confused. And the information's out there. They can go searching for it, but if you get it right here, great. So if you go down here and you look at some of these switches, let's see if I can get down there first. Everything is off right now in the aircraft except for the beacon light. And that, in most aircraft, you will keep on for the most part if you're going to be flying the aircraft pretty regularly. You usually don't even flip it off. Down here you have something called alternate static air source. So what is that exactly? Well, some of your gauges up here rely on an alternate static source of air for them to function properly. Your altimeter and your vertical speed indicator here in the analog version of this Bonanza, as well as glass cockpit aircraft as well. And what this is this is designed so there's a static source outside the aircraft. There's a port that reads a static source of air for these instruments. But if you accidentally get into some icing conditions and that static source gets frozen over and it can't read the static air, these gauges will not function properly. So this is the alternate source for that. So if you open that up, you're going to be using the alternate, so it's a different source of air, static source of air that you're going to be using at that point. So that's what that's for. Down here, the alternate air, so this is a fuel injected engine. It's not a carbureted engine that's in this aircraft. The alternate air is an alternate air source for the air intake in the engine for similar situations. So if you were to get icing built up in the filter in the front where the air intake is, you would pull this. Well, I can get back down there now. You would pull this and use this as an alternate air intake. The downside to using this is usually this alternate intake is usually drawing hot air from around the engine cowling and not cold air from off the nose of the aircraft. So that's what that's for. In case of engine fire, pull firewall air control to close. So what this does is this shuts off any type of airflow into the cockpit. So all your air vents, if you were to get an engine fire or you were to you were to start getting any kind of smoke in the cockpit, or in this particular aircraft, there is a meter. Where the heck is it at? Oh, here it is. If I can get back down to it. Right here, this meter reads carbon monoxide. So if it was to detect it and start going off, you would want to close that, and you'd want to close off your defrost and your cabin heat. Any type of air that could come from beyond the dash panel here, because in an aircraft like this, as well as like a Cessna 172, the heat in this aircraft, it doesn't have a separate heater. The heat is actually air that's being blown across the exhaust pipes under the cowling. And the cowling is, if you didn't know, if I can get back up here, is the hood up here. So you have exhaust pipes coming off of this engine, and ram air is coming in and being scooped, and it runs past the exhaust pipes and then into the cockpit. That's what will warm the cockpit up. The vent blower is just, think of it as like turning on an electrical fan in your house somewhere. That's all it is. It's just an electrical fan. This particular blower over here, this is for generic blowing. This is mainly used for your heat. So if you're not using your AC, you're going to use this blower. If you're using your AC, you're going to use the AC blower. So it's a separate one, and you'd have to turn the AC pump on right here. And I'm going to talk about a couple more switches that I've had questions about in this particular aircraft that people are not certain of, and that being the standby gyro. The standby gyro switch, what is that for exactly? Well, in this particular aircraft, it's actually part of you could call it a pre-flight or pre-engine start check. This gyro, this is an electric-driven gyro pump. It does not run off of the engine. You have a pneumatic pump that functions and runs your attitude and your gyros that are in here, your attitude indicator and your heading indicator or directional indicator. If you didn't know, there is a gyro in this turn coordinator, but it is electric, DC electric. So it runs off electricity. So when you flip this switch, the battery switch on, I don't know if you guys can hear it because I've got the volumes kind of adjusted where you can hear me, hopefully. That sound that you're hearing, that whining, that is the electric gyro in the turn coordinator. Now, when the engine is running, and the pneumatic pump is running and it's functioning properly and it's running these gauges here, when you shut the engine off, the whining seems a lot louder. That's because you have all these gyros going because the engine was running. Well, the standby gyro does not run this, your turn coordinator. It runs your attitude and your heading indicator. It's a backup. So normally your engine is running this. So if you just turn the battery switch on and you see it says gyro warning, that's because these gyros are not running yet. The engine has not been started. Now you'll watch this test light, or this light. Here's how you can test your lights, by the way. The annunciators, press that button and hold it, they'll come up. You'll actually flip this on and this light will extinguish as a warning, and another light will pop up letting you know that your standby gyro, electrical gyro, is on to run your attitude and your heading indicator, or HSI. So when I turn that on, normally you don't see these come up like and operate until you start the engine. But if you turn this on right now, there you go. So the engine's not running. We're draining the battery very quickly. We need a minimum of 23 volts. So I might have to start this video over. But anyway, so now all this is working without engine power. So if you lost your engine, you would flip this on. And you'll notice that the standby gyro is lit up now and the gyro warning has gone away. So if you flip this back off, oh, by the way, when that's on, you're going to check your instrument air. Now you can see the vacuum for your instruments is at its proper level, which should be more than 5 there. But if you flip that off, you'll notice that goes away, that zeroes out, and now these will start to fault, and you yet again have the gyro warning indication. Let me flip that battery off for now. I'm just certain I'm going to run the battery down in the aircraft here. This is a study level aircraft, so pretty much everything in here is functional, and you will run the battery down. Continuing with some of these switches, some people are confused between alternator, standby alternator, and primary and secondary on your load meter. How does this function? Well, when your engine is running, your load meter, all this does is tell you what load is being shown here. So you actually have 2 alternators on this aircraft. One has a output of about 100 amps, I think, and the other one only has an output of like, or was it 80 amps? 80 or 100 amps? I don't remember. The standby only outputs like maybe 30 or something like that. So you can't run everything electrical in the aircraft on that one alternator. Eventually, your bus volts are going to slowly continue to decrease over time. So if you ever run it on your standby alternator, that is a situation where you need to get back to the ground. But it will run everything long enough, hopefully, it's all circumstantial, of course, that you can make a normal landing if you lost your primary alternator. So what you would do is, with your battery on and your alternator on, you would show a load right here, and that's from your main alternator. Flipping the alternator on and off, or not having alternator on at all, while the engine is running, is not a problem. You can flip those things on and off. You're just basically drawing current from the battery, and it's not being recharged properly. Same thing for generators, alternator generators. So, and right now the load meter is on primary. So what you would do during your run-up is you would actually flip your, well, it's on my key bindings. You'd flip your main alternator off, flip your standby on, and you would flip your load meter to your secondary and check the load and make sure that that standby alternator is taking the electrical load of all the electrical systems in the aircraft. If it's down at 0, you got far too many electrical things happening. You got too much stuff on. You got too many lights on. You got, prop de-ice on, something. You're going to have to start turning some electrical stuff off. So you would check that during your run-up. So that's what I'm doing during my run-ups when I'm flipping these switches and I'm looking over here. I'm checking the bus volts and all that stuff. And then you would flip it off and make sure that it zeroes out. So at that point you don't have any alternator on. Then you flip back to your primary so that the load meter will show the primary alternator and whether or not it recovers and takes the load. And then that would be a part of your pre-flight run-up checks. So hopefully I'm not skipping too much here. I had a whole bank of stuff in my head that I wanted to cover. You would check in this aircraft, every one of these circuit breakers can be pulled and it will cut the electricity off to whatever you pull here. So, pre-engine start, you're going to check all of your, or at engine start, depending on how the checklist is defined. You're going to check all these circuit breakers, make sure none of them are popped out and they're all pushed in. This aircraft has an autopilot, and the autopilot works off of electric trim, and a real danger in aircraft is what's called a trim runaway. It's where, how can I explain this simply? It's basically where the autopilot begins to trim the aircraft, and it doesn't stop, and it just continues to trim, either nose up or nose down. Either way, both are deadly. And the way you would stop that, if you disconnected the autopilot, and there's 3 to 4 different ways depending on the aircraft on how this can be done. One, hitting the autopilot engage disengages the autopilot. Secondly, hitting the flight director, because anytime the autopilot is on, the flight director will be up on the attitude indicator. Hitting the flight director and getting rid of the flight director will also disengage the autopilot. On your yoke, you have an autopilot disconnect, which will also disconnect the autopilot. And usually your trim, just by simply touching your trim, which it's not, I am trimming, but the electric trim is not on in the aircraft right now, so it's not showing that moving. It thinks I'm just using my bare hand to move that. So normally if you just hit the electric trim with the autopilot engaged, that will also disengage the autopilot. If you tried all four things and your electric trim is running away with the autopilot and none of that disengages the autopilot, you're going to want to know very quickly where that circuit breaker is. Autopilot. Disconnect it. That will cut off all electricity to this autopilot and its functions. So the moment you pull that, every signal that this autopilot is trying to send to the servo motors to move your trim, your ailerons, everything will stop. So if you had a trim runaway, you probably wouldn't even go to, trying to just simply disconnect the autopilot. You're going to go right down here and you're just going to pull the autopilot circuit breaker immediately. Like I said, it's a deadly kind of thing. So anyways, you could check that while you're checking the autopilot. Excuse me guys, my phone is actually blowing up right now. So my plan is, let's see, I think I got Navigraph charts pulled up here. So I've got Mike 91 up here and Mike 54, and I'm currently looking at the winds at Lebanon. So it looks like the preferred runway is going to be runway 1 to land on. It's got a 9-knot headwind and a 5-knot crosswind. So runway 19 would have basically just the opposite. It'd have a tailwind. This particular aircraft, you can land with a minimum tailwind if need be, but it's not ideal. So let me just, I'll just start the aircraft up, and I'll try to talk through. I'm not exactly going through a checklist. I've got a checklist, and normally when I get in the simulator here, I just kind of go through what's called flows. And you're supposed to back them up with a checklist. In reality, I would, but it's a flight simulator, for crying out loud. So if I forget something, it's not a matter of life and death. But I mean, I have a full checklist for this particular aircraft, but I don't know if I want to just go through every little nitpicking thing. So just to start with, sitting here in the aircraft, the first thing I would check once I got in here would be the emergency landing gear is stowed, which I don't have a view selected for that. If you've ever been in this aircraft and you didn't know it, it's right here. And it's in its stowed position, so you would actually unstow it and crank it to crank the landing gear down. And I always get rid of the yokes during this phase of starting up the aircraft, just so I can see everything. I have a lot of switches bound to my flight yoke and my throttle controls, so you're not going to see me flipping some switches, but I'll try to make mention of it as I do it. So the other checks I would do is just ensuring that everything is off. Like I said, the beacon light is on and the alternate static source is stowed where it should be. The next thing would be fuel tank. So we have, you can only draw fuel from the left or right tank in this aircraft, and I tend to draw it from the left to start with, so that's the left tank, because I'm a big guy and it helps to balance out the aircraft pretty quick. I check all my trims, aileron trim, no rudder trim in a Bonanza, in this Bonanza, so no rudder trim, just an aileron trim, it's centered, and I would check my elevator trim. Make sure it's at least zeroed out. And let's see if I'm going through just a few more checks. Make sure all my switches are in the proper position. Everything is off. The oxygen is off. And the oxygen is basically you flipping on oxygen tanks. You know, this aircraft doesn't feed you oxygen. It would be an oxygen tank located somewhere in the aircraft. So this is trying to simulate you basically putting an oxygen mask on and turning the oxygen on if you went up to above 12,000 feet. Per the Federal Aviation Regulations, you would have to have oxygen above 12,000 feet. Or at least if you went beyond, I think it's 30 minutes, beyond 30 minutes above 12,000 feet. Well, they have a limit to that, should I say. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to look that up again. So above 12,000 feet, you have to have oxygen. 12,000 to 12,500 feet. For any longer than 30 minutes, I believe, you have to have oxygen, supplemental oxygen. Above 12,500 feet, you have to have oxygen, no matter what. Doesn't matter. There's no duration of time. Let's see, what else have we got going here? Okay, so let's just start this thing up. I think I've run through everything just about. Oh, cowl flaps. Go ahead and get the cowl flaps open. Let's see here. So cowl flaps, if you didn't know what that was, cowl flaps is underneath the cowling of the engine where the exhaust is, and what that allows, excuse me, it allows prop wash and air just coming in, being ram air coming into the engine to flow down and around the engine and out of the cowl flaps, exhausting engine heat. So that's a simple way of putting it. Anything that I discuss here, go and fact check it and look it up. You know, there's a wealth of information out there. I can't go into detail on every little thing, but so here we go. This is going to be lengthy. Sorry, guys. I'm doing this because some people asked for some commentary on what I'm doing. Okay, so for this particular aircraft, prop lever is going to be all the way up, mixture's all the way up, full rich, and the throttle is all the way up at max power for the engine start. So you'd make sure your beacon is on, bring your battery, your alternator on, and if you've run your battery down, you don't really want to be flipping any more switches at this point. You're going to get the engine started and get make sure the alternator is working. But I don't think we've run the battery down that much. It looks like we should have the proper amount of volts there. Normally I go through and I'll flip on my panel lights and I will adjust my lighting, especially if it's a little dim out or dark. So, and at this point I would also check my annunciator lights, make sure all the bulbs in the annunciator lights are working. And my landing gear is checked down, and I have 3 green indicating that it is in the lock position. And from right here, you're going to use your engine priming pump, auxiliary fuel pump. So what this is going to do, this is going to prime the engine, and it's got a low position, a high position. It's going to prime the engine with some fuel, 100 low lead fuel, which is most commonly used for these type of engines. You can use others, but 100 low lead. And all you're going to do is you're going to flip it on for anywhere from 3 to 5 seconds. Usually about 3 seconds is good. So you can go low to high, 1, 2, 3, and you're going to flip it off. I failed to mention you're going to look for fuel flow on the fuel gauge. At that point, all you're going to do is you're going to keep the mixture and prop full forward. You pull the throttle all the way back and push it up about a 1/2 inch. I usually only will push it about 1/4 inch, and as I turn the key to the start position, I will maneuver, because in reality this is kind of how it works. As you crank the engine, you're going to increase the throttle a bit, and a lot of times it can't just set at a 1/2. Sometimes you got to work the throttle just a little bit to get the engine to actually start. So I tend to do that even in the simulator. Now what I'm going to be looking for is starter engaged. Once the engine starts and I release the key with the ignition switch over here, I'm going to immediately check for oil pressure right here. As long as I have oil pressure, I'm good. And then I'm going to immediately look and make sure the starter light, which is going to be, well, I'm holding the button, but it's right there. That's the starter. So I'm going to make sure that light extinguishes. If that light is still on, that means you have a stuck starter. The starter is continuing to run and crank. And if the engine starts and the starter is continuing to do that, you are immediately going to kill the engine with the mixture. You're going to put the key in the off position, and you're going to kill the battery and all electrical. Well, the battery and alternator. You're going to do that really quick. The engine is still primed right now. We haven't messed anything up. So let's flip that back on. We'll get the key in the right position here. And that will, if you kill the battery, that will kill electricity to the starter, killing the starter. And it's a starter just like you would have in your vehicle. And even those things can get stuck. A hung starter will burn a car to the ground if you can't get the battery unhooked. Because you don't exactly have a battery disconnect switch in a car like you do here in this aircraft. Alright, so let's get the mixture all the way up again. And we are ready to start. So let's just start the aircraft. There she goes. I'm going to look for oil pressure, have oil pressure starters out, adjust the RPM. We're going to keep it right around 1,000 or 1,100. And we are about 700 feet above sea level. So I'm going to lean the mixture a good bit. And we're just going to check our engine gauges here, make sure the oil temperature is starting to come up, and we'll monitor our cylinder head temperatures as it rises. And we do have a very small amount of fuel flow. It's not even, it's moved up, but it shows no indication here. It's below 3 psi, or 3 gallons per hour, should I say. And your manifold pressure. I'm going to try not to just go over every little thing, guys. I'm not sure what I should talk about, what I shouldn't talk about. So when you start the engine, the aircraft's avionics is off, so we'll now turn them on. You always start the engine with the avionics off. So here comes the avionics. We already know that our standby gyro works. And while everything is coming alive, usually one of the first things I like to do is test the autopilot. And in here I do it a couple different ways. I come down and I have it programmed to my flight yoke to pull up the flight director, so I don't necessarily have to push the buttons and stuff down here. I have everything down here programmed, or I have it bound to certain keys in my flight yoke, stuff like that. So here comes the flight director. I'll pull that up and it shows wings level, so the autopilot is not engaged. We'll acknowledge the 530 and 430 here, so that they'll start booting up and getting our GPS position, or our coordinates, should I say. So flight director's on, and if I'm going to test the autopilot, I need to engage, well, the heading is already at least 30 degrees off from our initial heading. That's at, looks like it's about a 300 heading. I'll engage the heading mode on autopilot, and you'll see the flight director moving, as well as it's not moving here because the autopilot is not engaged. So you don't see the flight yoke moving. I'm moving it. So what I've done is I've engaged heading mode, so the flight director's moving. And if I was hand flying, I would simply follow the flight director's indication here. But if I'm going to test the autopilot itself, then I need to engage the autopilot. So here it comes. That's engaged. Now the autopilot is trying to steer to the right. So then you would want to disengage that, or you could leave it engaged and then move your heading bug to the left. Watch the flight director move. Now we'll engage the autopilot, and now the yoke is moving and the autopilot's doing it. So let's disengage that. And as I did, the reason I disengage it between this, because the first time I disengaged it, I actually did it by pushing the button down here to disengage it. The second time I disengaged it, I did it on my flight yoke. Now the third time I disengage it, I will actually disengage it with my electric trim. Now I'm about to check the electric trim. So autopilot will turn left because it's left, but I'm going to set a pre-selected altitude up here. And I'm just going to set it to the altitude I'm going to fly at, which is going to be about 6,000 feet, I think. Haven't really checked the icing levels yet, so went way past that. So there's 6,000. Heading mode is active right now, but the autopilot is not on. So now I'm going to, I'm going to put it in vertical speed mode. And I'm going to raise the vertical speed here to about 500 there. You know, you see the flight director climbing, showing a climb, but you don't see the trim doing anything. That's because the autopilot is not engaged, just the flight director is. So let's engage the autopilot and watch the trim. See, now it's trimming nose up. Now we'll disengage it, and I did that with the electric trim that time. So each one of these functions to disengage the autopilot works. So that's why I disengage it in between each one. So now we can just reset this. And I don't actually use, I don't use this thing up here because I have it, like I said, I have it bound to my throttles, and I've got all kinds of switches and stuff here that I can use without having to use the mouse. So now everything is up. To turn it all off, all I have to do is hit the flight director and boom, it all goes away. So we'll reset the trim. Actually, we're going to need about that much nose up trim for our flight. So that's how you would check the autopilot in this aircraft. One more thing you can do to check the autopilot. All right, let's just bring up the flight director. So if you just engage the autopilot, the flight director will come up just like that. And right now, if you just hit autopilot, it's going to maintain a wings level attitude, and it's going to hold the current altitude that you're at. So it's engaged right now, but you don't see it moving or anything. Now, if I engage the heading mode, well, I'll push it to here. You'll see the flight director move, and you'll see the yoke move yet again, and you see it trimming, and it's trying to stay at this altitude. There's a little bit of wind buffeting around outside, so it thinks it's flying, even though we're not going anywhere. The last thing I would do to check stuff is to actually pop the autopilot. And you see the autopilot is off, flight director disappeared, everything is off. It stopped. I'm moving the yoke, autopilot isn't doing anything now. So we'll go back in here and we will re-engage the circuit breaker. Here comes the autopilot, and it's got to go through its checks again. And we're just going to flip everything off. So everything's working. You know what I haven't done? I need to check for any active failures in this aircraft, which there are none. Engine condition is at 98%. That's good. Oops. And the transponder is already in mode C, or altitude reporting mode, which is mode C. So we'll put it in standby. And usually I come over here when I start the engine and I start a timer over here. Oops. Let's try that one more time. Crap, I went past it a second time. Count up. I start a timer right here at engine start, just to monitor that. Now, I don't use this for that because I will sometimes use this on an IFR flight for an approach. So I use this as a separate one. The flight time will start counting at liftoff once the wheels leave the ground. So I want a time from the moment I started the engine. I want to know how long it's been. Now, because we have tip tanks, here's our tip tank fuel levels, and these are the transfer pumps for them. I will usually cycle these through, make sure the green light comes on. That indicates that the pumps are working. Sorry guys, I got like the hiccups and some stuff going on over here. I just ate, so well, not just ate, maybe 30 minutes ago or something, just before I got on here talking. Let's get rid of that. That's annoying me. Okay, so you can cycle them, and if it's terribly cold outside, which well, where is it at? It's 11 degrees C. or about 50 degrees Fahrenheit outside, so it's not too cold. I would also turn the vent blower on. You can hear that running in the background now. And you'll notice the load meter jump when I turn that, because it's taking an extra electrical load. Now if I flip this, the load meter, you'll see it zeroes out. That's because it's trying to read the standby alternator. So we can flip this alternator, well, not there, I have to do it up here. We flip this alternator off and turn the standby on. And has it failed? It is showing absolutely nothing. What the crap? I just checked this. There's no active failures. Why is it not showing anything? Okay, well, it should be. I got both alternators on right now. Okay, let's do this. Let's bring the engine up. Might need to be at 17. 1700 RPMs. Duh, it wasn't showing anything. Let's flip that back off. Was it showing something before? Well, it's extremely high. It should come down within about 2 minutes. Let's flip to our primary. Flip that back on. Well, it should be given some indication, but it's not showing anything. Oh, it just jumped back up, didn't it? I'm trying to watch my RPMs. Well, it is working. Standby alternator is active. Okay, we'll go back to our primary. Flip the standby off and flip the main on. Don't want to get the engine too warm sitting here, or the cylinder head temperatures. Okay, so this is going to be an extremely long video. So I think I'm going to end the video here and make a part 2, and we'll just move forward from there. Alright guys, so check out part 2.